Okay, so in this tutorial, I'm just going to be running through different adaptation and mitigation examples. You will have all sorts of examples yourself through your own course and your own resources provided at school. There's different examples given in the textbooks and the various sites that you have access to. So what I think I'll do is I'll go through some of the ones that I've developed here, but then try to give some context behind them. So by mitigation, we mean efforts to reduce the amount of heat-trapping greenhouse gases. So this is obvious things like improving energy efficiency and switching across to renewable energy, having more sustainable transport systems, and then working with the environment to sink more carbon. These are all mitigation efforts. And then adaptation, which are the efforts to adjust in order to absorb and manage the impacts of climate change. Well, this can be lots of things. You've got conservation projects to do with the forest environments, mangroves, for example, land use changes, working with your agricultural sectors in order to manage those systems really well, improving kind of the hard infrastructure, building design, preventing flooding is a major one. So adaptation is dealing with the kind of the impacts of climate change and how do we absorb and create buffers around them. And then it deals with the responses to as well to these problems as well. So in the center here, we've got some examples of what could be considered mitigation and adaptation. This is an interesting word, an American word, building weatherization. So this is just sort of weatherproofing your properties and buildings. That might mean improved insulation, improved ventilation, and making properties more resistant to some of the impacts that climate change can bring. We've got water and energy conservation here. So by conserving water, we can do this by improving our catchments, improving our agricultural systems, our land use. We can manage forests better to conserve and retain water. And so in doing that, we tend to make our ecosystems healthier. And a healthier ecosystem is going to actually mitigate and improve carbon sinks. So for example, a good example might be peatland management, where a healthy peatland is going to hold water and it's going to sink more carbon. So as I said, there's lots of examples that you might look at, and these are some of the examples that I've got through the site. And what's interesting here is that we just dwell on global and national scale. So when you're developing a piece of writing on this, it's very important that you would develop scale as a concept through your discussion. So at the global scale, a really good mitigation scheme, in addition to, of course, the COP conferences and then the targeted cuts in emissions, what we should refer to here is perhaps RED, which is the UN Programme for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. So this includes national projects, also bilateral projects. So there's over 60 partner countries who are looking to preserve and extend their forests and the health of their forests. And of course, in doing this, they increase the carbon sink role of forests. And it provides vital environmental and socio-economic services. And so, actually, I'm going to come back to a point here later about decentralization and the importance of community-led projects. So the socio-economic services, how do we integrate local people into these projects? So another example here, we look at a national example then. We've got the sort of we've got the solar panel project in the Sahara Desert. This is in Ouarzazate in Morocco. Now this will be finished in 2020 and will produce electricity for 1.1 million people. So this is a classic example, isn't it, of switching from fossil fuel-based energies to renewables. And that's a very important change that countries are needing to adopt. But don't underestimate what the US have done in terms of their shift away from coal to shale gas. There has to be a sort of sound economic decisions made, and to switch to renewables overnight is basically impossible. But what the US have done by switching from coal to shale is they've reduced their carbon emissions massively. Even though they're still using a fossil fuel, it's considered that gas produces approximately half the amount of CO2 compared to coal power stations. So having sensible decisions around our use of fossil fuels as we move forward is still part of our mitigation strategy. So other examples that I've looked at then are peatland management in the UK. So the UK, even though it's a small country, is home to 15% of the world's peatlands. And so within each hectare of peat, it's estimated that 2,500 tons of carbon can be stored. So these peatlands have been threatened by agricultural development, draining of the peatlands, which dries them out. And so restoration schemes across the UK, have looked to increase the capacity of that carbon storage, try to prevent the kinds of land uses which are threatening them. And that will provide an important sink, but it will also mitigate against extreme flood events. In Germany, they have a taxing of freight scheme. So the HGV toll applies to all large HGV vehicles that weigh in excess of 7.5 tons. This is a tax scheme based on the kilometers that they drive and their presumed pollution. And so this incentivizes European haulers to modernize their vehicles to reduce the carbon emissions which they produce. Other sustainable transport schemes, cycle subsidies, for example, these are increasingly popular. The cycling infrastructure could be developed as an idea. There's lots of examples coming out of the urban unit, for example, there where you could cross over and develop some ideas there. But the nice example is coming out of the Belgian government, where it incentivizes commuters to cycle to work. So companies can pay employees 22 cents per kilometre cycled, free of taxes. This is per day, return, to work and back. And in addition to that, companies can purchase bikes for their employees with 120% of the value tax deductible, so making it a subsidy. So really interesting different examples there, different scales being explored, and of course, supplement that with your own examples too. So when we think about adaptation schemes at the global and national scale, well, really adaptation, needs to be more nationally focused. At the global scale, we can definitely think about, say RED schemes, the UN RED schemes. There's definitely adaptation there, and we've got the Green Climate Fund, which is there being organised at the global scale. But countries need to be adopting their own adaptation schemes. And a key idea here is this idea of decentralization. So moving decision making and design away from big government down to the local level, to the community level. And all of these examples which I'm going to explore here have done that in some way. So we've got soil and water conservation. So farmers across Belgium and the Netherlands have become responsible for soil and water conservation over their land. They've been incentivized to build weirs, which are these little barriers in the river, and that holds water back. They're monitoring and measuring groundwater levels and soil moisture content. So they improve their understanding of their land in terms of its providing that environmental service of water retention. And that, of course, if you can retain more water in the farmland areas, you reduce the risk of flooding in populated areas. So Ghana is also looking at a decentralized land and water rights scheme. So the government has a strategy there for increasing social services to lower income groups living in forest communities. So this would include small-scale irrigation schemes, providing them with secure tenure, ownership of their land, so that they'll invest more in protecting that land. And so through this scheme, they can help organize at the community level a way of managing and conserving forest land. A much grander scheme is being conducted in Holland around some of its major rivers, including the Rhine. They've spent 2.2 billion euros on 40 separate projects. And here they've been building very large dikes, removing some of these dikes, creating space for the water to flood into the floodplain in areas where that's possible. And so, they're really making room for the river. And they have this idea of living alongside floods, but creating spaces for those floods. And another really good example is mangrove protection. And if you've done the coastal unit, you'll have a lot more information on this type of adaptation. So this is the largest project of its kind in Sri Lanka. They're protecting over 21,000 hectares of mangroves. And then they're doing that as well through this community engagement, providing alternative jobs, training, providing microloans for 15,000 poor women in 1,500 small communities adjacent to the mangrove forests. So the whole idea about this is creating sustainable livelihoods that protect and renew mangrove forests as opposed to deforesting them. And by protecting the mangroves, you provide that buffer against the storm surges and the floods that come with cyclones, and the heavy rains and monsoons. So as I said, use your own examples as well, but try to develop this concept of decentralized governance as part of the global national scale efforts to mitigate and adapt.